Thank you. We've been joined by Assemblyman Avenatti from Westchester County. I hardly know where to begin. I will make the general observation of both of the testimonies that you have presented, that they are limited and narrowly directed to specific things, which I would guess are the aspects of this that you want to talk about, while not talking about enormous areas of hydrofracking that are important and relevant and that other people who have testified today have talked about. So I'd like to question one, if we can take one at a time. Dr. Cline, you note in your testimony an involvement, I guess, with the Quebec Office of Public Hearings on oil and gas regulations in Quebec?
Yes.
So I assume, therefore, you are aware that Quebec has recently banned any further hydrofracking in the province.
They have still not finished their regulations yet.
They've announced a ban.
That's the same situation as here until they have been able to develop their regulations.
Well, they permitted 31 wells, and then they decided you'd be better off banning it. Is that? Can you shed any light on that?
They did allow exploratory drilling. They took the approach that they wanted to define how large and the extent of the resource. There was never any intent in that to do developmental drilling. It was entirely to see to assess the extent of the resource, pending developing final regulations for full-scale development, which is in process at this moment.
I will ask the same question of both of you that I asked of others, which is, are either of you aware of any peer-reviewed published studies on the health impacts of hydrofracking?
I am not aware of any studies that have been done. Like I said, there is a need for data because, like you said, this is a new process, and to be able to connect dots, we do need that data.
Dr. Cline?
The health effects of hydraulic fracturing are obviously, as I mentioned, multifaceted. I'm talking about the subsurface operations and whether or not there is a pathway of those fluids to the groundwater sources. And it's well documented in the literature, a lot of which I gave as references in my white paper, including the EPA's own 2004 study showing that there is no risk of the fracture fluids to the groundwater sources from the deeply buried underground source target zones.
Well,
you're talking about a broad range of things from air to surface operations, and that is not what we're here to testify about. We're trying to narrow it down to put away the concept that there is a risk from the actual fracture stimulation in the subsurface and try to focus your attentions to surface operations.
I understand that's what you're trying to do, and I infer from your answer that you're not aware of any peer-reviewed scientific studies that have been published either on the health impacts of
whether they've been peer-reviewed or not, I don't know, but there are many studies that have been in the literature on this subject, and many of which I've referenced.
On the subject of health impacts or on the subject of groundwater contamination?
Showing that there is no pathway of any of these substances to the groundwater, which would certainly imply that there are no health impacts if there is not a pathway to exposure.
Okay, so the short answer is no, you're not aware of any. I want to go back to one where you talk about methane and the fact that any methane that may result in water or elsewhere coming up to the surface is not coming from the fracturing that's taking place down below, that there's no pathway, as you refer to it, from a mile down to the surface for the methane. Is that reasonably accurate?
That's correct. The methane, as I mentioned, such as at DIMIC, was fingerprinted with carbon isotope fingerprinting. as being sourced from a thermogenic shale as opposed to biogenic, but it was sourced from a shallower shale.
But does that mean it is impossible that the hydrofracking activity that is taking place down below could not in some way, form, or fashion cause the methane that is above it to be released?
No, it's not really.
Even if there's not a direct pathway.
It's not related to the production zone in the subsurface because, again, we have over a mile column of cement and casing separating the two. And as I mentioned, the perforations in the casing at the
methane
bottom
doesn't
of the...
have to come from the casing or from the piping. The methane comes from the rock formation. And if you're hydrofracking below it, which is an industrial activity that has an impact, is intended to have an impact on the shale around it, could it not have an impact on the methane that is above it that causes that methane to be released, even if there isn't a direct line or connection?
No, because we're not creating any fracture paths that far from the target zone, as I mentioned. From microseismic testing and our reservoir modeling, we know that the fractures that are created through hydraulic fracturing only extend a few hundred feet above the Marcellus Formation itself, whereas the methane that is occasionally gotten into groundwater sources is coming from just the first few hundred feet below the surface, close proximity, and sometimes, and very often, naturally occurring in the water sources. There is no connection between the fracturing and those shallow zones.
Ms. Blake, you offer up several studies or assessments to support your contention that there are, I assume, to support a contention that there are not health effects associated with either air emissions or drinking water wells. For example, in your testimony, GasStem USA collected water samples from a site, various sites around a vertically fractured well in Otsego County, and found no problem. Are you suggesting, therefore, that the testing of a single vertically fractured well is representative of all wells and would be representative of all horizontally fractured wells?
No, I'm not suggesting that. I referred to that particular well site because it's the one I'm familiar with, and we do have data showing that a baseline study can be done. I did present that particular topic of developing a water quality monitoring program at the EPA technical workshop, the first one on chemical analysis. There is a lot of discussion about doing baseline studies, and the industry is moving towards establishing programs to do baseline studies for that simple reason. I'm not suggesting that it's either way, so.
So it's not representative. We shouldn't take it as being representative. You're not offering this as being representative of all wells in all cases.
No. Like I said, I believe that water monitoring studies should be done.
You then follow that with a reference to a study that I'm not familiar with in Garfield County, Colorado, that there is not a health crisis associated with oil and gas activities in the county. Saying there is not a health crisis is a far cry from saying there are not health problems. Does this study say that there are not health problems in Garfield County, Colorado?
The study did mention that there were some problems to do with the emissions related to benzene when they did a risk assessment. Like I said, the key for my presentation is containment. Benzene, some of the benzene did come off the open pits that they have, And if New York moves towards closed, contained frac flowback pits, then that will lower the benzene emissions from the well site and diminish some of those concerns.
So then this study did indicate there are some health problems,
They did
while saying
indicate
there is not a health crisis.
they did indicate through their risk assessments, based on the levels of benzene in the air, that there could be a higher risk of having a health effect related to benzene the closer you were to the well pad. And that's why I reiterated, I said, if we focus on moving towards contained systems, then that particular pathway will be eliminated. There's a lot of discussion in our state about Colorado and about Pennsylvania, but I see New York State as being a very environmental forward-looking state as far as the regulations go, and using a lot of those problems that they face, we can see how to do it in this state, and the regulations already cover a lot of that. There was an air modeling study as a part of the GEIS, the supplemental to the GIS, and they did mention that very, very topic about using setbacks to lower some of those risks.
We've heard some discussion from others who have testified today about air emissions and the various sources of air emissions from drilling, which would include truck traffic, generators, not just what comes out of the well, but from a variety of other sources. Did this study in Pennsylvania take into account all of those various sources of air pollution?
I believe they set up their equipment at different sites, which include some of the sources you've mentioned.
Did they also then monitor all the trucks coming in and out of the various sites? And did they monitor the generators, as well as whatever is coming out of the well, and all of the other equipment that's associated that otherwise wouldn't be there?
When they did their study, I believe it was a comprehensive study. They included all that in it. And they were really adamant to say that it was not a chronic study. It was a short impact study. So it just dealt with acute toxicity. And
We would appreciate receiving a copy of that study.
Okay.
Certainly, what we have heard from others this morning, and what we know of air pollution and sources of air pollution, and what common sense tells us would be that thousands of trucks a day and portable generators, as well as all of the other equipment that otherwise wouldn't be there, is going to be producing some sources of air pollution and air pollution problems that didn't previously exist in this location. So we'd certainly like to take a look at that study that you referred to.
We will make it available to you.
Thank you. The remainder of your testimony, certainly where you start off and talking about the fluids, seems to focus on, is there a pathway? Is there a source? And if the fluids don't escape, if there isn't a direct contact, then there can't be a problem. What about all of the wastewater that is removed, and some of which is currently being taken to places in New York State, which, because of federal and state regulations, is not being tested for any chemicals or radiation or anything else before it is disposed of? And what about all of the other waste that is being trucked, some of it into New York State right now, that is not being tested because federal and state regulations don't require that it be tested, and then it's being disposed of in landfills and in other places in New York State? Is that not a potential pathway for harmful substances to reach both human contact as well as groundwater and air pollution.
Are you talking specifically about the transport from the well site to the...
Not talking about the transportation itself, I'm talking about the substances that are being transported.
It is
It's self-evident that all of that additional truck traffic is going to produce problems also, but I'm more concerned about what's in the trucks and where it ends up.
Okay. Well, I believe what I said was containment is a key. So if it does stay in the truck, then it's not going to be an issue. But I did model in the event of if a truck carrying maybe 6,000 gallons of frac fluid based on the concentrations of the particular flowback that came out of the Ross well in Maryland, that if it happened to have an incident and lose its cargo in the Susquehanna, I did model that, and the numbers showed a very minimal impact on the water quality within the Susquehanna River.
I'm not even talking about accidents. I'm talking what's being done deliberately.
wastewater
I'm
treatment?
talking about wastewater
Okay.
that is coming up out of the wells, and then it's being trucked to plants. It's not being tested for what's in it. It's being treated, quote unquote, in plants that don't have the capacity to treat the items that are most likely in it, and then it's being discharged, probably into surface bodies of water. The same thing is true for the solid substances that are being disposed of, which, because of federal and state regulations, is not tested by anybody. It's not tested by the companies because they're not required to test it. It's not tested by the landfills where it's being dumped because they're not required to test it. They're happy to take it. They get paid to take it. They take it, they dump it. Nobody knows what's in it. It is, in my opinion, a virtual certainty that there's a lot of very nasty stuff in it, but nobody's testing for that. But it's going to end up in our environment. It is in our environment. It's going to end up in the groundwater. It's going to end up in the surface water. It's my understanding that in Pennsylvania, I mean, because the flowback water, I mean, forget all the other noxious stuff that's in it, but it's so salty that when it was dumped into the rivers after being treated, because it's not treated for salt at these plants, they push it through the plant, but they're not taking out the salt, that they had to stop doing it because the utility companies downstream, their equipment was corroding from all the salt.
I could speak through experience, what we did over there in Otsego County. We did test the flowback water. We had to test it before it was submitted to the Watertown treatment plant because he had to be aware of what was in it and see how it would impact his permit, his SPDS required permit, if he would go over his limits on his effluent or not. And so the DEC and the EPA did require that wastewater to be treated. And I believe it's within the best practices that I work on instituting within the industry is know what's in that wastewater and ensure that it does get treated. And so in order for him to receive that wastewater, he had to know what was in it, and there was a big questions about the biocides that were in the wastewater, if it would have an impact on his sludge treatment procedure, and he did run some toxicity tests, and I do have that data, and I would gladly make it available to you to go over to see exactly what was required by the DEC before that water was treated in Watertown and what they had to go through in order for that water to be released.
Is that kind of testing taking place in all cases now? Is it taking place in Pennsylvania before it's shipped to New York or to any place else in all cases?
I'm not sure how they do it in Pennsylvania because I know the plant that Dr. Conrad Volz talked about, the Josephine plant in his paper, was kind of grandfathered into some kind of clause where they didn't have to do pre-treatment standards. The only wastewater treatment plants that could accept wastewater would be those involved in the National Pre-Treatment Program, which means they're plants that accept industrial waste. And they have the treatment capacity to handle the wastewater from the industry, which means they're able to treat it through the different steps of the process. Now, the plant down in Josephine, Pennsylvania, that Dr. Volz referred to, did not have any pretreatment program, from my understanding.
So your understanding would be that that kind of testing is not taking place in all cases now in other places in the country,
In other places, in Pennsylvania, you mean?
or elsewhere?
I don't have the answer to that. I can find it for you, but I know within New York State, as a part of their Speedies program, you have to have a pre-treatment program to accept industrial waste. And before you accept new water, you have to prove or do what they call a headwork analysis, which means you need to know what's in that waste before you accept it. And so even within the draft supplement, they do talk about it, and they do list the different wastewater treatment plants that are in New York State that do have pre-treatment programs in place.
And does that also apply to the solids, the rocks and the other items that are disposed of in landfills?
That one I'm not aware of. I know about wastewater treatment, so we can find out and make the information available to you.
I can address that if you'd like.
Sure.
Up to a limited extent, it's not my expertise, but I am a little bit familiar with the Chemung County and Steuben County landfill operations that are accepting drill cuttings. Those are landfills that are modern landfills, lined landfills, and they did have a study done looking at the composition of samples of the Marcellus and what the effect would be of landfilling that. And the DEC also took their own samples and did their own analysis. Both came to the conclusion that they felt it was safe to landfill it. I have read the study, and I know there are people that have other opinions about that, but both DEC and the counties had commissioned, or the landfill operator had commissioned studies that gave scientific backup to their claim that it was not hazardous, and they are monitoring the radioactivity level of the cuttings that come into the landfill continually.
Are they? Well, neither federal nor state law requires it. Are they testing every load that comes in to determine what's in it, not just for radioactivity, but for all of the other things that can be in it too?
I don't have knowledge of that, but
Thank you.
Yeah, a few questions. Ms. Blake, you said that one of the ways to make hydrofracking non-polluting, you referred to rerouting truck traffic off streets and routes where susceptible populations live. I think if we passed a law that said you can hydrofrack anywhere in the state of New York that you want, as long as your trucks don't go on a route through areas where susceptible populations live, we will have effectively banned hydrofracking from the state of New York. How do you run a hydrofracking operation in New York State without running the trucks on routes where susceptible populations live?
That's a good one. I was referring to the local level. I am a parent, and I do have 5 kids that I raise over there in the town of Maryland. And just like everybody else, I do have concerns. And I feel that if, in terms of susceptible populations, I think in terms of a local school, this is where I feel the local, have that ability to, over their road use agreements and things like that, to run the trucks in the less populated areas, or less, whatever they feel at the local level would be sufficient. I guess that's my best way to answer that. So.
Well, I think it would be just about impossible to do hydrofracking in the Marcellus Shale in this state if you were doing so on the condition that your trucks don't go on routes where susceptible populations live. Either of you could comment on this. The 2005 federal legislation prohibiting EPA from regulating hydrofracking. Am I correct in assuming that your industry lobbied for that legislation, or at least supported it, and that in the intervening years has not tried to persuade Congress to repeal it? Yes?
It's for either one of us.
Yes.
I was not involved in that process, but I can comment on what my understanding of it. That was, you have to understand, that was right on the heels of the 2004 EPA study that was conducted that came to the conclusion, very convincingly, forcefully, that hydraulic fracturing did not pose a risk to the underground sources of drinking water.
But Congress doesn't ordinarily, on its own, get the idea to prohibit EPA from regulating something just because a study found that that something was not an environmental hazard. They usually, just say, okay, if it's not a hazard, we'll assume you're going to work on something else. Frankly, it defies imagination to think that that legislation didn't get enacted without the strong advocacy of the oil and gas industry.
There were
give me
people.
A break. Congress didn't just wake up one morning and say, I think we'll prohibit EPA from regulating hydrofracking, and we haven't heard from the oil and gas industry, but we're going to prohibit this regulation anyway. That's not what happened.
I think they found that it was unnecessary because there was no pathway migration from the subsurface to the shallow.
No, I didn't ask you.
And I don't know anything about the lobbying.
I asked, didn't the industry advocate for that prohibition, and has the industry in the intervening years said, that prohibition is really inappropriate. We welcome the scrutiny of EPA. We would welcome the opportunity to defend our industry. We would welcome appropriate regulation because we read testimony that says that hydrofracking is safe if there are appropriate things in place, and we would welcome federal regulations that would make sure that appropriate things are in place. Has your industry taken that position with Congress?
I don't have any knowledge of that. I'm a scientist and engineer. I'm not involved in the political process.
I see. And so you haven't, I assume you must read a lot about the topic. Neither one of you has happened to notice an article in a trade association journal that says oil and gas industry trying to get Congress to remove this prohibition so that we can be appropriately regulated? You haven't read any such articles, have you? This line of questioning is pretty silly, isn't it? We all know the answer to the questions that I'm asking.
From a scientific standpoint, it is not necessary, in my opinion.
Because scientifically, we should just rely on the industry to regulate itself? And that's because the history of the oil industry is that it does such a wonderful job of regulating itself and making sure that nothing can go wrong? Your experience as a scientist tells you that about that industry?
Every step of the process is regulated by either a state or federal agency. Just because the actual hydraulic fracturing portion of that step was exempted from EPA control does not in any way mean that it is not regulated. States regulate, the federal government regulates air, water, So you're talking about a very narrow part of the process, and that process is highly regulated by state agencies.
But EPA does not regulate hydrofracking. And your industry works very hard, I'm quite confident, to protect itself from being regulated by EPA, an agency that has a whole lot more resources to do research and a whole lot more legal tools than most state regulatory agencies. And your industry works darn hard to make sure that EPA doesn't require any of the kinds of protections and mitigating measures that the two of you have testified about.
I believe the state regulatory agencies are far better equipped to regulate hydraulic fracturing than the EPA. They do not have the expertise or the personnel in that area. Geologically, conditions are variable from state to state, and the local enforcement regulatory agencies, I think, are far better equipped to do that regulation.
Okay. Now, earlier you were testifying about how the methane that was getting into the water at one of the drilling sites didn't come from the hydraulic fracturing. Is it your belief that it was just a freak coincidence?
In that particular incident, it was a combination of a human error and local geologic conditions in an area that was new to drilling.
So it was a result of the drilling. It was a result of unique geological features and human error.
We can get
And will there be hydraulic fracturing wells in New York where you can assure us that there are no unique geological features and no human error?
Nobody can be 100% certain, but in 30 years of drilling in New York, and as I mentioned, the shallow section of the hole is no different vertically or horizontal drilling wells. We have only had one case of methane migration in over 10,000 wells in New York. We have the regulatory and technical specifications that prevent these things, which I included as cementing completely to the surface and not allowing annular pressure buildup to errors that contributed to that. And as industry has understood the local geological conditions there in Pennsylvania, I believe feel that they have solved that problem through running a 2,500-foot section of intermediate pipe, which was necessary in that particular geological condition. When you do drill into a new area, you may encounter some unique things like that have to, your practices will have to accommodate. That's just the nature of any industry. We do learn, and I think the industry is very vigilant, and when there is an instance, they shut down, they evaluate, they come up with a solution.
Now, when you drill way, way down, thousands of feet, and then miles horizontally, if you hit a unique geological feature that somehow creates a hazard, that miraculously some of these molecules that we've been told in extremely minute quantities can cause significant endocrine damage. So if there is one of these unique geological features 3/4 of a mile down and several miles horizontally, how are we going to know, how are you going to know that unique feature way out there in the Earth's underground exists? And if somehow miraculously you know that there is this crack or whatever that's going to enable the chemicals to migrate, what are you going to do about it?
First of all, when we drill down vertically, we go to our target zone. That's the known zone. We go horizontally within that zone. It's not.
When you say known zone, you don't mean known in the sense that people have been there before and looked around. You mean you know what zone you're going to.
We also know, because we use measurement while drilling techniques where we are in real time evaluating the properties of the rock, being transmitted electronically to the surface, being interpreted. We know very precisely where that well is going, what the formation it's in, what the characteristics of that formation are. And as I mentioned, once we have perforated and flowing that well back, all flow is directed to the wellbore pressure sink. It does not have a pressure gradient or a way to move anywhere else. It wants to go to the lowest pressure, which is to the wellbore and to the surface.
Although in the methane in the water case we were talking about earlier, some combination of unique geological features and human error resulted in methane in the drinking water. And when it's a few miles horizontally out, and the unique geological feature may not be right there where your sensors are, what's our protection?
In the case of the shallow zones, the critical difference here is that those shallow zones do not have a path to the wellbore. They're behind the casing, so that if there is insufficiently cemented cement, it would migrate behind the casing in the cement. Whereas in the production zone, we have the pathway to the wellbore, and it goes up inside the wellbore. That's the critical difference.
So the chemicals that are shot down the well miles horizontally all get sort of pushed back into the wellbore and come back up the surface? All of it?
Approximately 70% of the fluid remains in the formation and 30% returns to the surface over the life of the well. Most of that.
So the point about the pressure of the wellbore bringing the water and the chemicals back applies to 30% of the water. 70% of the water stays down there, so that if there's and the chemicals, so if there is a unique geological feature like a crack that none of us knows about or ever will, 70% of the chemicals are down there where that crack is.
No, it doesn't quite work that way, as I describe in my paper in detail. The water leaks into the fracture face that's created, and the volume that is left behind only is enough to imbibe itself into the first few inches because the surface area of the fractures is so large. Once that is imbibed by the pressure of the fracture stimulation, the pore throats are so minute and so tortuous that what we call capillary forces hold that water behind, and only the gas can flow preferentially. It's a concept of relative permeability and capillary forces trapping that water for geologic time. It cannot move, and even if it did, even if there was a crack, as you say, once the well produces, the flow pattern will be to the lower pressure. You would have a hydrostatic pressure of the entire fluid column naturally from the surface down to that exerting downward pressure, and so naturally the only pressure direction could be toward the wellbore.
If a liquid is being drawn by capillary action, yes, if the thin thing that is drawing the water comes to an end, maybe the water gets stuck at the end of that capillary. But if it doesn't end, if it keeps going on, if it's a crack that goes on for quite a distance, doesn't capillary action draw that fluid all the way to wherever that crack goes?
No, because the capillary action only happens in the very tight, low permeability pore space. If you're talking about a crack, which is nothing different than what we're doing with hydraulic fracturing, that's a high permeability path. That path, when the flow direction is toward the wellbore, would take that water back to the wellbore. That's why we do get some of the water back, because it is in those fractures.
So you're sure that none of the unique geological features that are 3,000 feet down and several miles away where nobody's ever been, you're quite confident that none of those unique geological features can generate the capillary action that you've described? How do you know that?
That's my position, and I hope if you read my paper and references, I think the people that are in the petroleum engineering, porous, fluid flow and porous media, it's universally accepted that this is the case.
Okay. And one last question. I've heard many people say that we don't know what the chemicals are that these companies will be using, and that not only is that scary, but if we don't know what chemicals they're using, how can we do research where they've been using those chemicals to know whether they have gotten into the water? What's wrong with that statement? Do we in fact know what chemicals you use? Is that publicly available?
Well, let me say that I am totally in favor of full chemical disclosure.
Is someone stopping your member companies from doing that disclosure?
Most major companies have already disclosed. In fact, there is a new website available where you can go to that has been set up by the Groundwater Protection Council and the Interstate Petroleum Compact Commission, I believe it's called, where you can actually go to, on a map, to every well that's being drilled in the northern part of Pennsylvania, and the chemical disclosure list will come down. That's so far a voluntary registry, but the major operators that are doing the work are all members of that and participating in that. And I'm certainly in favor of full chemical disclosure. As far as your question about how would we know what to test for, it's not just, we know the suite of chemicals that are used, and we know the formation brine composition too. There are proposed regulations in New York list many chemicals and actual natural constituents that will be tested for in baseline testing, ongoing testing, and testing after the well pad is done. So in New York, we should have all the information we need to make those assessments.
But if researchers have wanted to do that research on existing long horizontal wells, have they had that information so that they could do that research?
Well,
I'm not particularly excited about the notion that years after hydrofracking has been working in New York, we'll be able to see whether the chemicals have migrated into our drinking water. I'd rather know that in Pennsylvania and other places, researchers had the opportunity to do that research and had done it and could demonstrate that the chemicals, in fact, did not migrate as you have assured us they won't.
Well, as you're probably aware from reading the Duke paper that's been talked about here quite extensively, even though that was a limited database of, I think, 60-some wells, one of the conclusions of that report is they found absolutely no evidence of any chemicals used in hydraulic fracturing in any of those wells.
And that's research in which they knew all of the chemicals that they should be looking for and was peer-reviewed research?
In my understanding, that was a peer-reviewed research paper, and they had access of the universe of what chemicals are used in hydraulic fracturing. So they could have tested for every conceivable thing, even though maybe only a small handful of those could have been used, but they found no evidence of any chemicals used in hydraulic fracturing in the well water.